Welcome to this Goodstart at Home video about toileting. My name is Kylie Warren-Wright and I'm the National Safe Work and Wellbeing Manager here at Goodstart. Toileting is something that can be really difficult for both children and families. As a mum of four, both boys and girls, I know how tricky it can be, and what works for one child does not work for others. So we're really fortunate today to have Amelia with us, who comes from the Mars Clinc here in Brisbane. The Mars Clinc are doing amazing work around continence and toilet training for children, and we've had so many questions from you. We thought it was a great opportunity to get someone like Amelia along to be able to answer those questions. So I'm really looking forward to learning some things today as well. But Amelia, I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you do at the clinic.
Absolutely. When I introduce myself to families, I usually say, my name's Amelia and my job is I talk about wheeze and poos all day. And usually the kids think that's really funny because I actually really enjoy talking about wheeze and poos, and I think it's an area that lots of people have lots of questions about. So in my day-to-day job, I'm in our face-to-face clinics where we use lots of cool technology to assess things about how wheeze and poos work. And then we also do telehealth clinics as well, so we're actually talking to people around Australia about their toileting issues. So in my job, I'm the team leader for the Mars Clinc, the Children's Continence Clinic, and that's leading the day-to-day activities of the clinic as well, doing training for our teams and upskilling them and making sure we're really fresh on helping people to understand their issues and what the new trends are in helping people with wheeze and poos.
I really love the use of telehealth as well. I think for families who don't always have access to be able to come and see you face to face, that's a real positive, being able to have somebody beam into home, be able to talk to you, see your child.
And so much of it is just helping people to understand what's going on. So we don't always need to physically assess to be able to help someone. And getting them a head start by telehealth just means that they're not waiting around for an appointment or waiting until the next time they travel into the city to do things. So.
Let's start with our first question from one of our Goodstart at Home mums, Amanda. So she's asked, how do you know when to start toilet training, and what are some of the signs to look out for?
And I think this is probably our most commonly asked question, and it's something that a lot of parents and families feel really anxious about because they'll be comparing themselves to other families. They might be comparing their child to their first child, and there seems to almost feel this pressure of, should I have started? Am I leaving it too long? Now, I don't have a definite magic age or a magic number, and that's actually really important for families to know, is that it's going to be different child to child. There's a general trend that most people start toilet training around that 18 months mark, but it can be anywhere up to 2 years or older before some families actually feel like their child is ready to start. So there's two sort of things you need to be looking out for when you're deciding, is it time to start toilet training? The first is looking at your family environment. So your child might be ready for toilet training, but your family might not be ready for toilet training yet. If you're about to move house, if you're expecting another sibling to arrive, if there's about to be some stress or upheaval, that is not the best time to start toilet training because there's already so much going on. Our little people really thrive on routine, so if we're introducing too much change at once, it's actually going to set you up for more challenges and maybe make that success take a little bit longer. So evaluating where your family is at is really important. When we're looking at the child, there's a couple of different things you can look at to help you understand whether that child might be ready for toilet training. First off, we talk about those more global skills that are necessary for toileting. So has that child developed the skills to be able to walk and maybe sit and balance on the potty or the toilet? Different children are going to develop those motor skills at different ages. So we're looking for them to have started to get some more gross motor skills to be able to do the physical aspects of toileting. We then think about more toileting specific signs. So for some children, what this looks like is that they might start to show an interest in what you're doing when you're going to the toilet. They might ask questions, or they might want to watch you go to the toilet and know, gee, what's mum or dad doing in the toilet? I think I want to be part of that action. They might also start to dislike their nappies. So you might find them pulling their nappies off, or wanting to take them off, or asking when can they take nappies off. So that's also a really good sign as well. We look at the nappies themselves. So if they're starting to have increasing periods of dryness in their nappies, that's telling us that their bladders are starting to get better and better at holding more urine, and that can then make them more able to start toilet training for wheeze. So those periods of dryness during the day can also give you a bit of an indication of how often they're actually emptying their bladder. And the longer that gap is between wheeze, the more likelihood that you're going to be able to have them out of nappies for a period before they need to go again. And lastly, we talk about attention span. So for a child to actually successfully sit on the toilet, they need to have enough of an attention span to be prepared to sit there for at least a few minutes before they jump off again. And you could have a child that's 100% ready in all other aspects, but if they're not prepared or willing to sit on the toilet for more than 10 seconds, then it might be that they need a little bit more time to develop those skills as well.
I'm fairly sure there are many of us who have chased a child with no pants on around the house because they haven't had that attention span.
Yeah.
And I really liked some of the pieces you touched on there. I think often as parents, sometimes when other parents are starting toilet training and you look at that and go, oh, should I be doing that? And working from that age rather than thinking about what's happening for you and your family and the environment, but also looking for the signs from your child rather than looking outside at what other people are doing. I think that's some really great points.
And they definitely don't need to tick all the boxes. So it's not sort of, if you're only doing one and not the other, you can't start toilet training. But if you approach toilet training and it's not quite going the way you wanted, it can be good to just reflect on maybe there are some other aspects that are needing to develop a little bit more before we try this again. So it's not the be all end all, but it gives you an idea of when to maybe start to look at toilet training.
Yeah, I think there's some really great tips. And that, again, that piece around your child and seeing those cues from them when they are ready.
Absolutely.
And this leads in really nicely. So we've had Claire in Queensland and Tiffany from Western Australia ask some similar questions. So what is the best way to go about starting toilet training, and should you use rewards charts?
And so that first day of toilet training can be really nerve-wracking because if it's your first child particularly, you've done all the prep, you've read all the books, you've talked to your family and friends, it hits the day and you think, what are we actually doing? What am I supposed to do to start this process off? So there's a few little things on that first day that are a good place to start. But the number one is having a conversation with your child and actually explaining what's going to happen. So our little people know a lot and they pick up on a lot of our language even if they haven't quite developed those language skills themselves. So explaining to them that today we're going to have no nappy for the morning and we're going to go and have a little sit on the potty a couple of times to see if any wheeze or poos happen. So really taking them in as explaining the process, so it's not a shock, it's not scary, but also helping them to understand that this is something that's good, it's really positive. We're going to go into undies after this. We're working together on a shared goal. So that's probably the first day, is a very gentle approach to letting them have a try on the toilet, minimising whether or not anything actually happens. When we do talk about having conversations with our children, it's also really important on that first day that you make sure you've got a plan for what words you're going to use. So different families will use different terminology. Some families say wheeze and poos, some say ones and twos, some might use a different language when describing what's going on with their body. And if they're going to be with you some days, but then maybe in the care of someone else on other days, it can be really confusing if we haven't made a plan together about what the terminology is that we're actually going to use. So it can be really good to engage with your care providers as well and just clarify what terms do they use during the day and maybe use those same terms at home when you're introducing it.
That's a really good point, particularly if you've got a child who's in early learning, having that consistent conversation in care, but also at home, makes that a lot easier for the child as well.
Absolutely. And so when we talk about rewards, there's probably as many different toileting reward charts out there as there is types of kids' undies. So there are definitely some people who use various forms of rewards for toilet training. The main thing that we recommend when we're talking about rewards is focusing on that positive reinforcement and making sure that anything to do with the toilet and toileting remains a completely positive experience for the child. So what that means is that if they do have a wee or poo accident, if they don't make it to the toilet in time, or if they flat out refuse to sit onto the toilet, we don't penalise them. There's no negative consequences. They're not being sent to timeout or having a toy removed from them, because all that's going to do is build up a negative association with toileting. So we focus on the positive and we focus on reinforcing those positive choices. So for example, if you've asked your child to have a sit on the potty for a minute this morning to have a try, if they sit and they have a try and no wee or poo happens, but they had a red hot go, we want to big up the reward there and say, good job, that was excellent. I'm so pleased that you had a try. We don't really hang anything on whether a wee or poo happens or not, because it's about the effort rather than the outcome. And that's something that you really want to follow through toilet training always, is that we have some behaviours in place that we really like to see, which is taking the time to try, or telling your parent or carer if you have had an accident. So we keep that as a positive as well. Thank you so much for telling me, let's go get changed together, rather than it being a negative consequence that they had an accident, because next time they're not going to tell you that that happened and they're going to stay in their soiled undies for the rest of the day.
Yeah, and I think that links back to the very first point you made about environment and being aware what's going on for you as a family. So if you do have a new sibling coming, new moving house, all of those factors that create, I guess, stress for you as a parent as well, means you might not be able to invest in that way too. So taking that into account as well to make it that positive experience.
Yeah, and our stress is definitely picked up by our children. So if we're becoming increasingly distressed by what's happening, that's probably a sign that we maybe haven't picked the right time for ourselves to be doing toilet training.
Yeah, that is actually a really good point. I know, it can be, as a parent, confusing.
Absolutely.
It makes you feel anxious, but it can also be frustrating because you're wondering if you're doing the right thing. And when you're constantly questioning yourself, it really becomes quite stressful for everyone.
And there's no rhyme or reason. So sometimes you'll have something that works beautifully one day and the next day it doesn't work at all. And you can't think what you've done differently, why the beautiful plan hasn't happened. And that's just kids. They might not follow the plan every day, and as long as we're prepared to go on the ride, usually that experience can stay positive if we're a bit more accepting that it's not always going to be perfect.
So with that in mind, what happens if children are not interested in toilet training? How do you know when to keep talking about toilet training or when to actually just take a step back and wait for a little bit longer? What do you do there?
It's really tricky, because most of the time people who are asking of that question of us of, should we push on or should we stop, their children are often approaching that older age. They might be 3.5, starting to get towards an age where they would have expected that toilet training would have happened by now. So there's a lot of pressure to sort of, what are we doing wrong? Have we missed the boat? Are we doing the wrong thing by our child? And there's a lot of anxiety and stress. So there's kind of 3 different directions you can go if you run into that feeling of not knowing if we're doing the right thing. The first is just to persist. So some children will just take longer, and they might just need that consistency over months and months of the same thing happening every day. One day they'll have that light bulb moment and they'll connect the 2 things together and they'll have that miraculous wee in the potty. Now, it can be really challenging for parents waiting for that magic day to happen, but if you're someone who feels comfortable with just staying the course, that's totally all right to just keep going steady and see if they improve. Your second option is to sort of take a step back and reevaluate what you're doing. So it could be that you're on the right track, but your approach just might not be right for your child. So for example, if you've been asking your child to sit on the potty, It could actually be that they really want to sit on the toilet like mum and dad. So you might need to invest in some equipment to help them sit on the toilet rather than the potty. Or it could be that they actually don't like the toilet environment and it's beautiful and it's clean and it's really nice for us, but to them they see it as a place where they're being removed from the fun. So perhaps we need to jazz up the toilet a little bit, put some posters up of their favourite cartoon characters, let them choose a special soap next time they're at the shops. Maybe they might like to pick some toilet paper with some pictures on it. So changing our approach to make it a place that's a little bit more exciting for them. If we haven't been using any kind of rewards or praise, that might also be a time to reevaluate as a family. How are we rewarding toileting, and have we been thinking about rewarding the effort rather than the outcome? Because if we've been focusing on you only get a reward when you do a wee in the toilet, rather than focusing on praising them for having a try, maybe introducing that as a concept will help them connect the dots of what they should be doing. Third scenario though is we actually need to take a break, and it's totally okay if you need to pull back and say, let's just have a month or two off toilet training, allow the child to just get back into their groove and their routine, and then reconnect. It's a break as much for the parents as it is for the child. And a lot of parents feel like if we take a break, we're going to undo all of that good work, we're going to end up back at square one. The truth is, if you've been battling along and you're becoming increasingly stressed and the child is starting to really form negative associations with the toilet, it's much better to just take a pause, everyone can recollect their thoughts, and then re-engage with the process with a fresh set of eyes. Oftentimes children are then re-excited or reinvigorated because we stopped doing that thing and we get to do it again now, and I actually really enjoyed sitting on the toilet like a big kid. Maybe they didn't realise that they enjoyed it that much. So that can be a way to reconnect, but don't feel bad if you need to take a break.
I like that because, again, as parents, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, and that just knowing that it's okay to stop and have a little break and come back, that knowing that it's actually okay and no one's going to forget about anything, or you're not going to set your child back, I think is really important. I did have one question around something that you mentioned about needing to jazz up the toilet. Yeah. Is it okay if you put your child's potty somewhere not in the toilet? Is that actually okay?
It is a tricky one. So, particularly when we're asking them to sit there for a minute or two and their attention span is limiting, parents tell us they might put the potty in the lounge room in front of the television to keep them there a little bit longer. I would say that what we're trying to do is build an association between what's happening in our body and the toilet as a place in the house. So it is ideal for most of our toileting activities to be happening around the toilet where possible. But what you might like to do instead is, if they're going to be sitting in the toilet and you think that they're going to be a little bit bored, playing some music or having a nice song that they can listen to while they're sitting in there, maybe it will help them sit there that little bit longer. We do try to avoid having a screen like a tablet or a video playing while they're in there, because we're really asking them to tune into their bodily sensations, and it can be really distracting having something in front of you that's a bit more interesting than the toilet. But that's where music can be quite nice because it's positive without being overly distracting.
Yep, I like that. So I absolutely was one of those parents, and that's why I was asking that maybe took the potty out of the toilet. Yeah. And I think that you've made some really good points there about the association that you're trying to drive, but also about the screens, because it can be something where you know that your child might sit for a little bit longer. With that, but what you're trying to do in the toilet is really important, and particularly that piece about getting in touch with your body and knowing what your body is doing as you're starting to get ready.
And it's got to be sustainable, so you're not going to be able to sit on the potty out in the middle of your space when you're at your early learning centre. So if we're doing that at home but then they can't do that while they're in care, it can be really confusing for the child. So we do want to keep it consistent.
Yeah, you're right. I think that's also a good point because it is the piece about when you do start to go to a shopping centre or somewhere social, having those same type of social cues and pieces around toileting. Now, I've got a quite a big question here, so I'm going to read straight off my sheet. So, we've had quite a few mums and dads ask about nighttime wetting. So where we've got children around 4 and 5 years old who are still in a nappy at night time but are having very full nappies overnight. So you sort of touched on earlier, that's one of the cues where we know someone might be getting ready for toilet training. What can you tell us about the nighttime wetting? So is it okay to keep children in nappies at that age, or should we be trying to get them out of their nappies or pull-ups?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think nighttime wetting is really confusing for a lot of families because they can quite often be having really good success in the day and children that are really engaged with toileting in the day, and they can then still be completely soaking through the nappy at night. So understanding what causes night wetting can actually help a lot with this, and it's actually quite separate to daytime training. So nighttime, being dry at night, is its own separate entity that will happen independently of day training. So it's really normal for a 4 or 5 year old to still be wet at night, even if they are trained during the day. Up until age 6, it's actually considered typical to be wetting the bed at night. So that comes from more global medical journals. So up until age 6, and that might be surprising to a lot of families, particularly if you had a 3-year-old who was dry at night and then their younger sibling is now approaching 6 and still isn't dry. But there's 3 things that cause a child to be wet overnight. The first one is how they sleep. So our body, in order to be toilet trained at night, needs to be able to wake up to that sensation of a full bladder. So as our bladder is filling, it's stretching, and it sends a signal to your brain that says, we need to go to the toilet. Depending on the sleep pattern of the child, for some of them, that stretch sensation won't be enough to wake them. So they will sleep through that sensation of a filling bladder. The bladder will reach filled, and then it will empty all by itself, and they will be none the wiser. So it's not a conscious choice. They're not choosing to stay in bed and wee. It's actually that their brain is not waking up to the sensation of the filling bladder. And those children who sleep like that, the only way that sleep pattern is going to change is with time. So as they grow older, their sleep might develop, or through something like a night wetting alarm, which is something we use in older children. So looking at how your child sleeps could be the first way to know if that's why they're wetting. The second reason is what their kidneys do while they're asleep. So our kidneys are our wee factories. So they make the wee that then travels down and is stored in the bladder. So for some parents, they can get really frustrated because their child will definitely do a wee before they go to sleep. And then in the morning, they've still got a big soaked nappy and they know that they went to the toilet. So where has it all come from? It's because their kidneys have continued to make urine while they're asleep. And what we know is that babies and young children will make wee at the same rate day and night. So they're just constantly making urine. And it's not until we get older that we develop that pattern of urine production slowing down at night. And that happens at different ages in different kids. So you might have an 18-month-old child who has actually slowed right down at night, and therefore their nappy doesn't really get very full. But on the flip side, you could have a 4 or 5-year-old whose kidneys are still very busy overnight, and they will make the equivalent of 2 or 3 full bladders worth of urine. So again, this is completely out of their control, and it is something that improves with age and with time. The last thing is how much their bladder can actually hold itself. So if you've got a bladder that is too small for your age, it's going to squeeze and empty before it reaches that morning point. So when we're looking at children with bedwetting in our clinic, we look at bladders as something that we can assess using some different techniques to work out if we can help with that side of it.
Yeah, okay. So as a parent who had a child that was still in pull-ups, older, and actually worked through that alarm piece where you'd have the alarm to try and help the child be aware. That's really interesting. That's information I wish I had have had.
I know about
when I was in that situation, because it's really confusing.
It is. And I think a lot of parents feel like that they're doing something wrong, or perhaps that their child is deliberately wetting the bed at night. And in most cases, the children are completely oblivious to it happening, and they can be really disappointed in the morning that, oh, I wet the bed again, but they are none the wiser. They didn't know that it was happening.
Yeah. So you mentioned it's common to wet the bed up until around 6. what happens if it goes past that age? And I guess that's a little bit like the situation I had. So what if you're sort of you're 7 or 8, still being wet at night, it's not improving. What are some of the treatment suggestions? Like what should parents do? Should you be waking your child up during the night?
And I didn't answer before about taking the nappies away, but a lot of people feel like if they were to take the nappy away at night, then their child might stand a better chance of becoming dry. But what we have found in our clinic is that because it's this deep sleep that's the problem, the child doesn't know whether they've got a nappy on or not. So you're giving permission to say, actually, it's okay to keep the night pull-up on, even if they are 7 or 8 years old. You're not making the problem worse because we know that the child isn't doing it on purpose. And if you can decrease the stress for you and the child by not having to change big soaked sheets, then a pull-up is actually a really good solution, and continuing with that is not going to make the problem worse. In terms of waking children up overnight, there's probably 2 ways that we can think about that. One of them is that if you have a child whose kidneys are very busy, they are maybe one of those children who have nice long sleeps. So if they're sleeping 11 or 12 hours a night, it's very unrealistic to expect that their bladder is going to hold all the way to the morning. So if it works for your family and it's not distressing to wake the child up and take them to the toilet early in the evening before you go to bed, it's totally okay to do, but just bear in mind it's not going to treat the problem. So it's not going to make them dry at night because they're not going to learn necessarily to wake up because you're waking them. The only way that they're going to learn how to wake is through a night alarm, because the alarms wake them up at the moment that the wee is coming out. So then the brain and the bladder can actually start to make that connection of, when my bladder is squeezing and full, I need to be awake. So night alarms are definitely something we would look at for, say, a 7 or 8 year old child. Once we've looked at all of those other factors of the bladder capacity, making sure that their drinking habits are okay. So a lot of people do try to restrict fluid intake later in the night.
That was going to be one of my questions.
Yeah, and it's good in principle, but it just depends on what their overall drinking habits are like. So if you've got a child who drinks very little during the day because they're very busy or very active, and then they play catch up in the afternoons when they get home, even if you've restricted fluid intake after dinner, if they've been drinking all afternoon, their kidneys are going to be processing that water while they're asleep. So rather than being a strict end point of not being able to drink after a certain time, it's actually better to look holistically at their whole day and make sure that they're having consistent fluid intake throughout the day so that they're not so thirsty at the end of the day. If you've got a child at 7 o'clock at night who's telling you that they're parched and they really want to drink and you were trying to restrict their fluid intake, it's much better to let them have a drink because there's a reason they're thirsty, and it's probably because they haven't had enough during the day. Then we can talk about, well, tomorrow we want to make sure that you're not so thirsty at bedtime. Let's try to have more to drink during the day.
So you raised some good points there. That one that was important to me was the piece around getting in contact with a specialist like yourself if you have these types of issues, because it can actually be quite tempting to hop on Google and do a search, and you'll have things like the sleep alarms pop up. But as you've pointed out, there's a lot of things you need to do before you get to that point. And if you're not sure about how it works, you could actually be it's not supportive of your child and what's actually happening to them. So getting in contact with someone like yourself at the Mars Clinc would actually be really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And, first point of call, you can always talk to your GP or your child health nurse, because they do have resources around these things as well. And then we're, I guess, that more specialised clinic that can help when those things aren't working.
Okay, now we're going to get on to the other side of things. So a few parents have asked about constipation issues and having poo accidents. So what can you tell us about constipation?
So constipation is one of those really tricky areas where a lot of parents might not actually realise their child is constipated in a lot of cases, or they might Google constipation, think they know what's going on, but then not be sure what to do about it. So constipation looks different in different kids, and I think the first thing to take home is that you can actually have a child who poos pretty regularly who is still constipated. So it's looking at some of those other signs that can help us know if a child is constipated. As a general rule, if you're pooing less than 3 times a week, or if you've got poos that are big or hard or painful, or if the child has to really strain to pass them, that's a pretty good sign that there's some degree of constipation going on here. But the other thing that can be a sign of constipation, which is really confusing, is poo accidents. So in toilet training time, poos in undies are pretty common because we're learning to recognise body signals, and we might not make it to the toilet in time and the poo might start to come out in undies. But poo accidents can also be something called overflow soiling. So it used to be called encopresis, but it's typically just called overflow soiling now. And what it is if you've got big hard poo sitting in your bottom, so in the rectum, which is the last part of the bowel, as your body makes more soft poo next time you eat, that poo will come down, it'll hit that hard one, and it'll seep around the outside and out into the undies. So it's really tricky for families because it kind of just looks like a bit of diarrhea or a bit of loose poo in the undies. It's often quite pasty, so it can be really stinky or sticky. And the number one thing the child will tell you is that they didn't know it was coming. They're absolutely mortified that it happens. And again, for a parent, that's really confusing. How did you not know that you were pooing in your undies? So if you are seeing small, smudgy, little smears throughout the day, and you're noticing that your child is not someone who poos regularly, so not a substantial bowel motion every day or most days of the week, you could definitely be suspicious that constipation is part of the picture. But you're not expected to be able to sort this out on your own. So if you have a little bit of a suspicion, talking to your healthcare provider, like your GP, is a really good place to start because they'll be able to do a little bit more investigating and know the questions to ask to understand whether truly it is constipation. It's really common during toilet training because you might have a child who's really comfortable to do a poo in their nappy and now suddenly we're asking them to do something different and poo in the potty and the toilet, and so they may start withholding their poos. So they'll feel like they need to go, but they'll hold it in because they don't want to have to use the toilet or the potty. So around that time of toilet training, if you start to notice these changes, that's probably another flag that we might be seeing some constipation creep in. The sooner you get on top of it, the better. So if your doctor confirms that it is constipation, they will quite often recommend something like a stool softener or a laxative. A lot of parents feel really anxious about giving their child medications and laxatives, but the actual purpose of those is to keep the poos nice and soft, to make sure we don't have any pain or discomfort associated with pooing, because that's the one thing that will put a child off pooing for a long time. Just one negative experience and they might never want to do a poo again because it hurt. So if you have been recommended by your doctor to take some of these types of medications, it's really important that you do take them and stick with them for as long as was recommended, because sometimes you can actually need a few months of really nice soft poos just to reset everything and let things go back to normal for that child.
And there were a couple of things you said there. So one, I just wanted to touch on the pain. So that's something that you'll see as well, whether it's a pain in the tummy or a sore bottom. Those are
so
also signs as well.
It never hurt to do a poo. So a child who's telling you that it hurts their bottom, if you can have a look at the poo, you'll probably know why it hurt, because they're usually a bit rounder than what we would think is comfortable for a little bottom. So if you think about sort of a 5 or a 10-cent piece size poo as being quite comfortable for a little person to pass, 20 cents is starting to get a little bit uncomfortable, and especially if they're a bit hard or crackly. If you're seeing 50-cent piece size poos, which probably sounds a little bit big, but these actually are really common in toilet training kids, that's too big. That's going to cause their little bottoms some pain. And if it's a hard poo, that's going to put them right off pooing for a long time.
And you also mentioned about when you start to see these signs, getting onto them as quickly as possible. How long is a good time to wait before you do sort of ask for some help?
That's a great question, because in a typical week you could have all sorts of things happening. You could have had they actually did a genuine poo in their undies because they didn't get there in time, which would be different to some soiling, which would be different to a poo in the toilet that was a little bit bigger. Mm-hmm. So you know your child best. If they look like they're in pain or discomfort, even just with one single poo, get onto that as soon as possible. If it's something like the poo accidents and the soiling or the smears, and you're trying to work out if it is just that they're not getting there in time versus this type of overflow, if you observe them for a couple of weeks, you'll certainly pick up a pattern by then, mm-hmm. and that is enough time to go and seek help. But don't persist with it for months and months if they're having difficulty with their poos.
That is some amazing information, and can I just tell you, it's been quite reassuring for me. So everything that we've talked about today, I've seen at some point or another with each of my children, and I think it just really reminds me that every child is different and unique. Absolutely. And thinking about them as individuals, like you sort of started off with that piece around being in tune with that child and being aware of that child, rather than this is what happened last time or this is what someone else has told me. Definitely. I think they've been some amazing tips. So I just really want to thank you for coming along and talking to me today. I have learned so much. And I'm really hoping that our Goodstart at Home families have as well. So we'll be providing some more information around Amelia and the Mars Clinc that you'll be able to access as well. And I'd really encourage you on the Goodstart at Home site to have a look at the toilet training blast off information. So that's helping sort of bring some of these tips together so you're prepared, and Amelia's given some great tips about the prep. It's all in the preparation, so not just waking up one day and going, I'm toilet training today. Really thinking through what that looks like for you as a parent. Talking to other carers if you've got other carers, and really preparing your child as well for what's to come. I think that's just, as I said, I have learnt so much today, so I just wanted to say thank you, and thank you at home to our families that have joined us today. See you later.